Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on this beautiful Sunday. Usually I compliment people for braving either terrible weather or whatever. But anyway, on a beautiful Sunday afternoon, and we're delighted to welcome back Tom Perry, who had to postpone his original appearance on January 14th because he lives in Los Angeles. So I know people here have asked you about your own experience with the fire. You want to briefly recount it?
Um, what it amounted to in our situation was that we got called and told to pack up to prepare to leave for a mandatory evacuation, I believe 6 times. And we packed and unpacked and packed and unpacked. And each time we thought we were going to have to leave, the firefighters, just absolutely ended the problem immediately for us. But finally we got to the point where we just haven't unpacked, and we still have most of our paperwork and stuff all packed up and ready to go. But the fires are gone, really. I mean, they're under control. And we had rain last night, so that helped a little bit, I think. I think LA is well, let's say, at least for the moment, is the tragedy is over. I mean, but we had nothing serious happen to us. It was just one of those things where they were trying to warn everybody and make sure everybody could go if they had to.
I think it's wonderful that the communication technology is such that you could warn everybody in the county, regardless of, I assume they have full access to the cell phones. So it must be the only way they can do that kind of blanket texting.
Yeah, that's how they did it. And the big problem that they had really was that some of the warnings were sent out by accident to everybody. In other words, you have to get out of, get ready to get out, and you would look at where the fire was, and it's 10 miles away or something. So it was just accidentally the system sent it to everybody a couple of times. But
better that way. So I asked Tom what paperwork, because I've been thinking about that. We're about to do some traveling, and I've been thinking about getting like a to-go box or bag, and what would we actually put in it. And so I asked Tom, and his reply was really kind of funny.
I made decisions that were based on the sort of conventional thinking. I was just saying one of the things I packed was my military discharge papers, as though there was some likelihood that I was going to get called up again at the age of 77, and my PhD diploma, which no one has ever looked at in 50 years. Or asked to look at, things like that, sort of crazy things. My wife packed up, I don't know, probably 100 photographs, but they were all framed. The most, valuable thing that I think that I packed was a supply of poop bags for the dog, which.
Well, under emotional pressure, I think we don't make very rational decisions. And, Tom writes about people in catastrophic situations or whatever, and they don't always make rational decisions, which will certainly be true in Pro Bono. And I think it's interesting that it happens in real life as well, not just in fiction.
Right? Well, it does. It does. It's, it's kind of crazy. It's one of those things that there's a book, it's just a wonderful book, and I cannot remember the name of the guy who wrote it, but I think his last name was Rodriguez. It might have been. Anyway, called Deep Survival. And what it is it's a book about people in emergencies, in incredibly quick emergencies. They suddenly happen, and there you are. And there are a certain number of people who immediately realize what they have to do and go about doing it. And and the rest of us kind of hem and haw, and we go over here, and we go over there, and we forgot what it is that we should have been getting over here, and we, wonder what we ought to be doing, and so on. But there are a certain number of people who instantly react and do what they're supposed to do, what will save their lives and the lives of others around them. And I found that I'm not one of those.
Yeah, but what's so interesting is that you write about Jane Whitefield. This is not a Jane Whitefield book, but Jane is forced into those kinds of decisions all the time. In fact, Tom has a Jane Whitefield book coming out next, isn't it?
Well, I'm not
in the future.
finished with it. Yeah.
Okay.
Until I get to the point where the editor says, that's it, and I'll authorize your check. Then I know that the book is done. But until that happens, it'll be a while.
Yeah, but my point is, you've been writing a Jane Whitefield book while you've been in a pressure situation such as Jane actually faces, and you flunked. And so, does that give you more or less confidence writing about Jane?
Well, let's say I'm going to try and streamline the decision-making process from here on.
Excellent. I love that. So I've been thinking about, deeds to the house, birth certificates, insurance, all those kinds of things, copy your passport, whatever, and putting it away. So I do think, and the reason I brought it up is whether you're reading fiction or in real life, if life is approaching a constant state of emergency, we probably all ought to think about, what is it that we would take besides our pets, which is always right. We have a lovely dog here who's on the floor, and you can't actually see him, but you wouldn't leave him behind, right? No. Right. So we're actually here to talk about Pro Bono, which is another of Tom's standalone books. But I've been thinking because I'm doing an event with a debut author called Kevin Wade on Tuesday, a book called Johnny Careless. And Kevin comes from the Hollywood and the screen world. He's a director and a screenwriter and garlanded with awards and other things. And while I read his book, I thought about screenwriting. Seems to me, because there's so many screenwriters who have come to writing, this is relevant to Tom, who have come to writing novels. And what are the two things that I think screenwriting hones in people like that? And one of them is dialogue. And the other is pacing, because you can't afford to have a script and people lag in the action. And the other is, in the movies, people have to talk to each other all the time. There's not passages and passages of description. And you came from that world before you started writing.
No.
No? Well, you were in that world anyway, part of the time.
Yeah, basically what happened was somebody had read my first two books. His name was Jim Corus. He was the vice president at Universal in charge of current programming and marketing. And what had happened was that, excuse me, one of the shows decided that they wanted to have a bunch of guest writers write, screenplays for this television show called Simon and Simon. And they, so they invited a bunch of people, and I was one of the people that they ended up inviting to write something like that. I was, but I had already written my first two books, and
So you'd already written The Butcher's Boy?
yeah, The Butcher's Boy and Metzger's Dog
Right.
were already written, and that was what he had read. That he said,
Okay.
you could write TV, and I said, no, I couldn't. I've never even seen a script. I don't know it. He had called me at work. I worked at USC at that time, University of Southern California. I shouldn't say that because it's not University of South Carolina.
Right.
Anyway, finally he talked me into going and at least meeting with him about it and so on, and it seemed like a good idea. And so I did, and I wrote a script, and they liked it, and so on, and so I got to write another script, and that time, what had happened was that my wife had at least read a script. I had never seen one, and so she said, why don't you try it, and if you run into trouble, I'll help you. And so I did. I did run into trouble. She did help me. And we were writing partners for the next 11 years in television. So
Well, am I wrong in saying that it does hone your skill with dialogues and pacing?
You were absolutely right. I think dialogue is well. Here's part of the thing. It's that when you write something, it goes on in a certain way in your head, and you have a sense of time in your head as to what this is taking. But if you write a 3 or 4 page dialogue scene in television, it's going to seem to you like it's an hour and a half as you watch it on the screen. What you learn is partly that learn how to recognize when a scene is over, and that's the pacing part. It's usually over about a page or two before you think it's over, which is why God made editors. But there's also I forget what the other the dialogue. What does it sound like when you actually say it? And of course, when you're learning to do this stuff, you're on the staff of a show, and you're sitting there watching dailies, and you realize that not only can one of the actors not pronounce some word that you put in, and so it sounds completely fake, or you just make it impossible for anybody to watch, and so that's the other mistake.
Right.
But there's a third thing that I think you learn from writing television and or movies, and that is to
I'm
be
sorry,
aware of
I'm
the camera.
signaling to her. There's water in the cooler right over there. Sorry. Okay.
Being aware of the camera, where is the camera set? What can it see? And who is it that's supposed to be seeing it? And what does it look like to them? If you're writing particularly something that's like a thriller or a mystery, somebody turns his or her head and the camera, shoots over to that scene. What are you actually trying to look at? You don't ever see all of anything. And if you look at a movie like something like, The Conversation, you actually get or Blow Up. You remember Blow Up?
Mm-hmm.
What can you see? How much can you see from here? Why is it you that's seeing it? You're making these decisions as you're writing, and if you can do that in a novel, as for instance, Faulkner had great experience writing television. I mean, sorry, not television, movies, and he worked with Howard Hawks, and he wrote some pretty good movies, and in a way you can see that same awareness in his novels. You can how do people come to know things? And that's part of the game, and it's a useful thing. I mean, almost anything that you learn is good for your writing.
Right.
It all comes up somehow. It all helps, but television or movies or something is a great school. It's also, by the way, it's a great source of learning how to use criticism, because when you're in that situation, there are several other people, 5 or 10 other people who are either writers or director or executive producers or somebody who's going to look at that script that you wrote, right? And they are going to evaluate it in terms of, is this going to help me to keep this show going, or is it questionable? Is there something in here that I can suggest to somebody to the writer to fix on the next draft? Because what they're doing is they're protecting their jobs. And so people are very sincere and helpful in their criticism, and you can't react to it in a hostile or defensive way. If you're smart, you will go into dailies and you take a look at what was filmed the day before, and one of the writers is going to turn to you, and they're going to say, gee, that's really good, you really, and you're not going to say, gee, you should have seen what it was like, what it was so much better before they suggested those changes. No, what you're going to say is, thanks.
Right. Well, I brought that up because when I read Tom, I can always sort of see what's going on. I think, in your books, especially the Janes, but also, was it like two books back where you had a lot of it in Indiana running along a river? I could see the whole thing, and I think Tom has a real gift for painting the backdrop, so to speak. But you don't waste a lot of words on it because, you're always pushing the action forward.
Yeah, well, readers, people who love reading, all of us, we have a varying amount of patience. And I think at times one of the sins that writers uh, commit that really harms the relationship with a reader is that when they suddenly realize they can't trust you to get to the point, they're going to do what almost anybody else would do in a conversation. The whole thing isn't just a written thing; it's a relationship with a person. I always kind of imagine the person as somebody, male or female, somebody like me. Okay, somebody who is interested in a good story, and what you do is you form a kind of pact with that person. That is, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to tell you a story. And the only thing I can really guarantee about it is that you haven't read it or heard it or seen it on a screen before. That's all I can say. I find it kind of interesting, and I hope you will too. And then you tell them the story. And when you're sitting in a room with a person talking, you can see in their eyes what their reaction is. But you can't if it's a reader. So you have to be your own critic. You have to, realize, gee, I'm really kind of taking more time with this than is necessary, and so you cross it out.
So, Tom, I've known you forever. We've been doing this together for probably 30 years by now. Tom actually once said to me, because I asked him why he always wanted to start his book tours here, and he said to me, until I come here, and he said, when we talk, I don't know what to say about my book, which I find to be really fun. But, you're a kind of, you're certainly not vicious kind of a guy. So why did you decide to write about assassin? I mean, the butcher's boy, and that's a really bad guy, and he kills people, and it's so unlike you. What attracted you to writing about the butcher's boy?
Because he's so good at it.
Okay.
No, actually, my wife has a cousin, or had a cousin, who was a very well-educated, well-known psychiatrist, and he was at one point, the head of a psychiatry at a very major hospital and some other things. And he said to me one time after reading one of my books, he said, "You must have so much anger in you." And I said, "No, because I get it all out on the page. Everybody ought to do this."
Right. But the other thing that Tom is really good at is fraud, and especially financial fraud. I still think that your book about insurance fraud in a small town ranks up there with one of the truly great. It's not quite a heist. I don't know quite what is the word we'd call it. It's sort of a heist, but not really a heist.
Well, in the case of
Pro bono.
It's partly bitterness that I've had a couple of experiences with financial fraud myself, and I was the victim. So it was, one of them was an investment in a municipal bond for the city of Seattle for a project that was going on in the city of Seattle, and it was supposed to be a project that was worthy of being funded by or let's say having the area be indebted in order to build it, and it was called the Holmes Harbor development. And I was talked into buying this municipal bond by the financial advisor of, at that time, well, I can't really remember exactly which of them it was, but anyway, he talked me into saying this was a great conservative investment, and freeze frame, fade out, come back, and 2 years or so later, I was informed that the people who had sold it were in federal court, and ultimately there were about 5 of them who were sentenced to prison, federal prison, for having issued this municipal bond, which wasn't one. And they actually sent me one of those things later on, like 5 or maybe 7 years later, something like that, notifying me that one of them was getting out and whether I had any objection to having that person,
Because you were a victim.
Yeah, I was one of the many victims, including another writer that I'm not going to mention because she hasn't mentioned it herself in public, but it has happened. And actually, this Christmas, on Christmas Eve, someone had fished out a check that I had written to pay a credit card bill, and mailed in the U.S. Postal Service mailbox inside the post office. And they fished it out during a weekend, apparently, and washed the check and wrote themselves a $39,100 check from my account. That was, and they did this on Christmas Eve, which was a great idea because then everything, he thought there was going to be a delay, right? That they wouldn't, And of course, what happened was the bank gets this check, and goes, what? Call them up. They texted me, to let me know that happened and whether I had approved that or not. And of course my hair was on fire, and that's why I'm gone. That was the last of it. That was it. And I said no, so I got the money back and all that. But I mean, this kind of thing is going on all the time, and constantly, and it's a lot of it is really terrible and tragic. And what I wanted to do in this case was to have a character who, who has had some experience with this and being on the wrong side of it as a teenager. That is, his mother was a widow. The father had been one of these guys who had, been a great achiever and worked himself to death, essentially, and left, the mother and son a bunch of money that had, and she ended up being married to the second time she gets married. It's to a guy who marries her in order to have an opportunity to get her money, and begins to bleed the money out of her account. So at the age of 17, he realizes that this is going on, and he looks at his mother's receipts and things and realizes something's wrong. And of course, he had suspected the new husband anyway, that he was, he didn't seem to ever go to work. He didn't seem to ever, have any profession. He didn't seem to, and so fade out. 17 years later, he's grown up. He's a lawyer. He's also a CPA, and he is really good, really good at detecting fraud, and getting people's money back from that. But
So you don't have a single track story here, right?
no, I love. Actually, I was just telling Barbara a while ago that Kirkus reviews, which always is real nasty if they possibly can be. If they give you a whole big nice
Snark
thing.
is what is the word he's looking for. They specialize in New York snark. And so I think anyone who reads, as a bookseller, I always regard their reviews with some cynicism, and don't often quote them entirely. Well, that's the other thing they do, is they give away the plot. But anyway.
Yeah, well, actually, to tell you what this is like, a couple of books ago, they wrote this like unbelievably glowing thing about one of my books, and I looked at it, and I kept looking at it, and I was waiting for the thing that was going to say, and then the wheels fell off, and it was, or something like that, some, terrible thing, and it didn't come, and I, and my publisher wrote me a letter and said, take a look at this, and they showed me the thing, and I said, gee, it's amazing. I don't see the insult. And he said, yeah, when I read it, I thought they must have forgotten who they are. So anyway, this time what they said was that Pro Bono is a lumpy, a lumpy but irresistible thriller. So I'd say that was the second nicest thing they've ever said to me in 32 books, which is pretty good.
So lumpy, define lumpy the way they wrote it.
Lumpy is what I like about it. It was. They've noticed that it was not the sort of straight arrow plot that I normally do. It appears to be three separate events, three major cases. The first one involving his mother, the second one involving a client of his, and the third one, I won't tell you what the third one is. It's three lumps. It's three lumps. So anyway, I mean, that was intentional on my part, and I was sort of glad that it showed me they had read it. They had actually read all of it.
They couldn't have called it lumpy if they hadn't noticed the third plot, right? Yeah, there you go. Well, I mean, you've always been really good, I think, at fraud, mostly financial sometimes. Well, actually, is fraud always financial? That's a good question. I hadn't thought about that. It's a semantic question.
Well, this one is all financial, but it shows you how, what I'm trying to do is talk about different ways in which this kind of evil perpetuates. Right. I mean, the first one is a person who is essentially spends his whole life being a fraudster, and is one of those people who's a sociopath. And you notice when you run into one of those stories in real life, they never leave the person with anything. Nobody ever steals like $100,000 and then stops. They will keep going until the person is absolutely destitute and has no money at all, and is burdened with false debts for years. That kind of person. And then there's another kind of person who gets involved in this thing, where essentially it isn't that money attracts bad people, it's that sometimes, in some cases, the money turns somebody who's okay into a bad person because of the temptation. They're just I've always found it was kind of an interesting thing to see somebody actually be corrupted, that has become a worse and worse person until they do things that they never thought they would ever do, and themselves.
Oftentimes it is sort of a slow step thing. I mean, I don't think Bernie Madoff started out with the idea of ripping off billions.
Yeah.
I mean, years and years ago, when I was a lawyer in Virginia, I was on the bar ethics committee, and oftentimes when you had a lawyer that would come up before with a question of disbarment and all for stealing money from client accounts, it always started out with something small. Maybe they had a $5,000 shortfall in payroll or something, so they'd borrow it from a trust account. But the problem is, once you get started, it just perpetuates. Nobody seems to do that and repay it and think, I got away with it. It becomes like, oh, if I did that, I could do it again.
Yeah. Or there's another. You're never in the last crisis. You're never in the last storm that you're going to have to weather, right? So, you get away with it once, you have a shortfall, 2 years later, all of a sudden this time it's not $5,000, it's $20,000 or whatever, and then all of a sudden these, numbers start adding up, and finally you get into these cases where, lawyers are withholding a $5 million settlement that they got from somebody, but it's in this particular book, I get to kind of play around with that stuff and then have the fun of showing how all of these were all actually one story, one thing that was going on. So, and
Well, Tom has a particularly poignant result in one of the stories, which points out the damage that innocent people can suffer around somebody who does that. And it comes towards the end of the book, and it really made me sad. I won't tell you what it is, but, the cost, not just to the person who lost money, but the cost to other people is kind of I'm trying to remember what the word I want is. But anyway, the fallout is wider than, just the immediate target. And I think we kind of overlook that sometimes, the damage it can do to people's lives way beyond the person who actually was defrauded.
yeah. I mean, it's, we're all delighted when somebody who's really bad, goes to prison for it or whatever. But, you also have, a wife and children who are going to a prison to visit daddy, I mean, that's for the next 10 years or whatever. And it's, these are all, other aspects of it. And I love to write about things that I haven't written about before. And that's sort of what I was doing this time. So, and it was kind of a fun thing to do in a way, because, I got to chuckle over what's really going on,
Well, you like writing standalone novels, which are
I do.
complete in and of themselves. So you wrote, how many Butcher Boys have you written now? Is it 5? Because there was one
It was
2 or
4.
3 years.
It was 4.
4.
4,
Okay.
yeah.
And Jane, if this one you're working on publishes, will be number 10.
Yeah.
But that started out as a 5-book contract. Where you, that was the premise of the first Jane, that he was going to write 5 books. And then I thought you would kind of be done with her, but she appeared to be irresistible.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was done with her. That is, I wrote the one book, and then my editors. One of the things that editors do is if you don't do anything, if they don't hear anything from you for a while, they call you up and they say, like, working on anything, It's like, no, I broke the bank at Monte Carlo, So, but so I said, well, I had written this one book, Vanishing Act, about this character, and I kind of been thinking about that I was done with the book, but I wasn't done with her, and so calls me back about 20 minutes later, and he says, how'd you like to make it 5? And I said, well, I never really wanted to do a sequel to anything or a series. So I don't really know. And then he mentioned a number, and I said, okay.
Right. Job security reared its head, didn't it? Yep.
Right, yeah. And it was, and the kicker was that I had to have one done a year, and it had to be ready and publishable on his desk every June 15th for 5 years. And so, I did, but the problem was during the 5 years, I thought of all these other things I wanted to do too. So I started writing more standalones, and then I started to get in those days. Well, it was sort of early internet, but I used to get I'd get an internet email, and it would be things like, when is the next Jane coming out? And then somebody else would write in, and it would be, if you can't think of a plot, I have this,
I just
really
did
good
that to him
idea.
at brunch. I told him, having watched the Waymo cars here in Phoenix and a couple of things, that he hasn't said a book here in Phoenix, and I had a couple of ideas of how he could use Waymo, a Waymo car and a hapless passenger or whatever else, that he could create one of his standalones. And knowing Tom, that'll percolate now in his head for a while, and maybe we'll see it. But it's true that it's very hard to resist giving writers plots.
Yeah. Well, that was the sort of thing. And then finally I got one that actually did it, and it was, have you retired or are you dead? So I kind of I thought
You had to
about it
answer
for a
that
while.
one.
Yeah, I thought about it for a while, and I decided I
But
should
you're a
write
really
one.
reliable writer. I mean, you have produced a book, I think, every year that we've been together.
Oh,
30 some books, right?
yeah.
Yeah. So it isn't like, there's no new Tom Perry coming. It may just not be the Tom Perry, if you're like a Jane fan or a Butcher's Boy fan, that you want.
Well, I'll probably stop if greed and fear desert me. At some point.
Yeah, but also,
Yeah.
I think that I think it brings you more energy to go back to one of those characters if you've written other stuff in the meantime.
I think that's true. I also think, in certain cases, and Jane Whitefield was one of them, and the Butcher's Boy is another one, where if I don't think about them for a while, I start to kind of miss them,
Right.
and particularly with Jane, and that was because she's a nice person.
Which you don't always write about.
Well, it's kind of refreshing after some of the other things, and this is supposed to be fun. People, we all have a lot of pretentious things to say about it, but it comes down to, you're telling a friend a story to amuse them. It's supposed to be fun, and ideally, you would sit down and you would tell a story, and then the other person would tell you a story.
Yeah.
And in a way that's, that's sort of what the internet would be if it were its ideal. We would all be doing that, and
It started out that way, but quickly got corrupted.
yeah. Well, it was probably much more interesting originally because it was just the ARPANET.
That's
it was
right.
The
Harmless exchange of conversation and stories, and now it's vicious.
yeah, but I mean, it started out it was professors only, really.
Mhm.
It was.
It was the U.S. military,
University.
wasn't it? I think
Well,
it was
the ori-
created for
the
that.
original thing
Yeah.
was the military, but when I became really aware of it, I was it was because all these professors were writing back and forth to each other about stuff when I worked in universities, and
Well, one thing I think to keep in mind is, as we are looking at cataclysmic events all over the world, that Tom writes about the particular, a thing, a difficult thing happening to like one person. And I think that's easier for us to understand, than trying to assimilate a very large scale. I mean, the best books about war are almost always focused on one or two actors, Eric Maria Remarque or whoever it might be. It's the Second World War is too big for anybody to fully comprehend, and so the way you navigate it is through an individual or a small number of individuals. I think James Benn does an absolutely brilliant job carrying you through chronologically through the war. Just brilliant the way he focuses. I used to love Alistair MacLean, The Guns of Navarone, a particular operation. And right now, I think, in a world that's so unpredictable with so many potential catastrophic things in front of us, it's great to write about an individual or two, or something that we can all relate to.
yeah, I think it's really all we can wrap our heads around, unless we're going to do like a giant encyclopedic thing that really is better done by a large number of people, I think, than by a novelist. I mean, a novelist is really what you're writing about is historians tell you what happened, novelists tell you what it felt like, and that's
Biographies are different than autobiographies for
Yeah.
some of those same reasons, right?
yeah, I think I don't know. It seems to me that writing an autobiography is something that's so alien to me that I've never really understood it. You know what I mean? It's often it's a pile of opinions. I can do a pile of opinions, but I can't decide even who I am, let alone what I would want
Right.
to tell anybody about it.
I've never quite been clear about the distinction between autobiography and memoir is. Does anybody have an explanation for that? I mean, there's a huge glut right now of celebrity memoirs, And, you know, to a great degree, they're money making operations. And most of them have ghostwriters, you know, so they're really more like a biography than they are authentically,
Well,
you know, a memoir or an autobiography. There are writers whose whole
yeah.
careers, in fact, ghostwrite. We have an event Monday night, and the protagonist in the second book is a ghostwriter. The first book I thought was great. I really enjoyed it. I'm not I'm not quite so taken with the concept of the second book, but the same principle applies. You know that what's it like to be a ghostwriter? What is it like to try to tell the story of somebody else's life, knowing that what you're getting is not always going to be truthful? And then how do you deal with that?
Well, you know, I think you have sort of two halves of that. One of them is hey, you know, the autobiography reads like a press agent wrote it, you know, because they're essentially piling on the self praise and all that stuff. And the other kind is somebody who you know is coming at it from a different point of view, where you know they want to find something that's scandalous, you know, which was something that we all like to read about.
Well, you have to lead an interesting life for anybody care enough to read, you know, the story of your life. There was a 2-page essay in the New York Times about Bill Gates' biography coming out called Source Code, which I think is a really great title because it's just about him as a child and his recognition that he was neurodivergent. And that led to the kind of childhood that he had. And so I think it sounded like he'd made an effort to be honest, but how much can we be honest even with our own memories, you know, and try to figure that stuff out? Anyway, how about questions from you? Because I think we've probably said all we can say about Pro Bono without spoilers.
Right.
Anybody have a question? Yes, ma'am.
I'm a Jane fan, and I've been hoping that you would come out with more. And every time I read something else, I'm like, dang it, I read that one. So
Oh.
I've read them all, so I'm excited about that. But how do you just sort of have things percolate in your mind, and then kind of start creating the story, or do you start with a character more and start imagining your character in different situations?
Can you repeat the question?
Okay. The question is what happens when you're writing a series? Do you essentially start with the character and figuring out what they would be doing in a different situation, and in the case of this book, the Jane book, I don't know if you know, since you're a Jane fan, maybe you know this, but Jane was pregnant about 4 years ago when I left her. Having now achieved the world record for longest pregnancy in history.
God, even worse than an elephant, really?
Well, it's been a while. I've written, you know, a few books since then. So, you know, it was time really to come back. And, you know, part of what made me think about it is, you know, I had always thought, you know, Jane was never going to actually get pregnant. She always wanted to have a child. And it was the only thing she really wanted that she hadn't gotten at that point. And it was, you know, and it was a real problem for her. And I wanted to conclude that somehow. And I thought, you know, I can't do a situation where she's going to do anything that's really dangerous, you know, intentionally if she's got this child. You know, she's just not the person who's going to do that. You know, she's sort of no matter what, she's always an adult. She's the person who keeps her head, and you know. But you know, I realized as I was watching these women in Ukraine when the war just started, woman carrying one child in an arm has the other one with you know, by the hand, a smaller one, and has like 2 backpacks on and all that stuff, trying to get onto a train to Poland because her husband had to stay and fight, and you know, that sort of thing. And I watched these women, and I thought to myself, it's real. It's real. It isn't. You don't decide when an emergency is going to happen. It happens, and how can you, you know, you can't simply ignore it and say, well, I won't, put my children in danger in that way, because they're in danger. What can you do? You can take them by the hand and try and. And so I started thinking, okay, then I had a way to start, a way to get in. And once you start in the story, you're hooked, and you.
Do we
you
assume
write the
from
rest
this
of
that
it.
Jane's given birth finally? No.
Yeah, you can, because it happens real early in the book. So it wouldn't be a big spoiler.
Yeah, that's
So-
one of the things you readers have to bring to reading serial fiction or whatever is that time doesn't operate like it does in the real world. And, you left Jane, she was pregnant, and, you come back and maybe she's coming to the end of the pregnancy. And so what if it's been 4 years? It's just like dogs never really age. If you have a dog that's a series character, the dog stays the same age while everybody else moves on. Although I will say for Robert Parker, he did actually Pearl, the first Pearl, the Wonder Dog, did actually get replaced eventually by a new Pearl, the Wonder Dog. But as readers, aren't you okay with that? Yeah, I mean, we just know that time operates differently in fiction. Yes, sir.
On the drive over, because I had seen a podcast with him. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Not you, it's me, actually.
On the drive over, I watched, I was remembering a podcast I saw 5 or 6 months ago. He was talking to the guy at Pensler Publishers, and he accused you, if I recall correctly, of letting her be pregnant way too long. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, if he ever does another Jane book, while she's pregnant, she's going to help a woman who's also pregnant get out of her dire set of circumstances. And so I had this all planned out to feed to you, but now I know you don't need it.
See, another person who can't resist giving you a plot. Thank you. You've joined me. I know. Right. But, I mean, really, don't you think that readers in general don't expect time to operate in fiction the way it does in the real world?
I think readers give people the benefit of the doubt. I mean, it's just,
No, I think of them as being elastic.
Yeah, I mean, I think of time as being elastic
Right.
in these things too. But I do what I try to do and have always tried to do with Jane was, have them follow in a kind of linear direction time, but sometimes it gets compressed. And I sometimes lie about it too. I sometimes say,
Right. Well, you lie for a living, so why not?
well, I say what, it makes the amount of time. It wasn't 5 years. It's only 2 years, or something like that, or
Right.
whatever, so that people aren't necessarily going to look for ways. I mean, there are readers who do this, but look for your mistakes. Look for but you said it was 2 years, and that's really 5 years.
Yeah, but even in this book, you portrayed this young man at the beginning when he's a young man, right? And he
Yeah.
recognizes his mother's being ripped off.
Yeah.
And then we vault into, the same guy years later. Now he's a lawyer and a CPA and, trying to prevent stuff like that from happening. So,
Yeah.
that's a time leap in the book.
Well,
So,
there's also a thing in this book that is kind of a theme, and then and the time jump helps because what it is a bunch of people who don't understand each other at all, don't understand each other well, and don't realize, for instance, when they're dealing with this young idealistic lawyer, that he's not going to give up. He's not going to back away. And if he has to kill you, he will.
I also think the savvy reader, a person who's been reading Tom Perry, would know that it can't be a lumpy thriller. I mean, you already know that if these things are going on in the book, somehow they're going to be connected. I had the same reaction to reading Johnny Careless, the book I'm reading about Tuesday night, and it looked for a while like the car ring theft group over here didn't have anything to do with the guy that died on the beach. But, you know that eventually something will bring some of these things together, because otherwise, why would the car ring thief even be in the book?
Right. Why would? Yeah,
Why would
exactly.
he? You
Why?
know, I mean, and
But-
you know, if you watch television, a lot of the crime dramas. My husband and I are very fond of a French show called Murder in ... And the reason we love it is that it takes you all over France, and drone photography is so fabulous that you get astonishing views. In fact, there's an Australian series called Darby and Joan. And never mind the plot line, but the photography of Australia is just like heart-stopping. But anyway, you can generally tell if you're paying any attention and you know the actors that the bad guy is going to be the second most important person in the cast, because otherwise, why would he be there? He's not going to play some bit part. And my husband sometimes says to me, "How do you always know who did it?" And I'm going, "Because I'm paying attention to, to the importance of the actors." But in a book, you have to sort of think that way. Why is that there? If just to waste space? No.
Oh.
No, but you're really good at that.
Oh, well, thank you.
I know. I love Tom's books. I really do. Every time I come to one, I'm so excited, when I get my advanced reading copy and I go, "Oh, goodness, another Tom Ferry. Yay." Did you have another question?
I'm speaking kind of series. Are you, and I might have missed this, have you been approached or thought about doing any of your standalone or the Jane into like a mini series or something?
Well, there's the old man.
Like little Harlan Coben, right?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
The old man, is that's
That's
was,
Tom.
That was based on one of my books. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was.
Yeah, which was a really terrific book. And it didn't have a sequel, in my opinion, when you wrote it. I thought when it was over, it was definitely over.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's. This is jumping into the, the sort of, don't ask how laws or sausages are made, or TV shows or books. What, for my whole career, basically, a large part of my income has always been from options on books. That is, movie and TV options. And like The Butcher's Boy, my first book, was continuously optioned for, I think 19 years before I took it out of option and let the time go by for a while, and then introduced it again, and then it's been optioned pretty much all the time since, and so are most of the others, just about all of the others, and it's partly because I have a really good agent, and his name is Eric Reed, and he works at WME, and he always keeps these things in motion, so that if something goes out of option, he sells it to somebody else, and so on. And but the problem is, options are cheap, and making a movie or a television show is enormously expensive, and it's a big job to do. So, there are a couple of things in the works right now, several things that might become TV shows or movies. Everybody who options a book feels that they're doing it because they think they can turn it into something big and good. And just in my case, I've written 32 novels, and one of them has been made into a series. So it's but they've just about all been optioned at some point.
Tom writes the kind of books that you can envision as a film or a TV thing. As we started out saying, he's great on dialogue and he's great on pacing, and so the potential for an excellent movie or TV thing exists. Sometimes when somebody has something that's really successful, like Harlan, then he's bankable, and that's why maybe Harlan's books get made into movies or whatever far more often than a more, he's already been test-driven.
A lot of his are
and so
British too. There's British,
Yeah, it is. Well, French was the first
production.
one. I was
Yeah.
sitting in a coffee shop with Harlan called Expressions over on Main Street when right after he had written, I can't remember the name of the first one. It was like his sixth book, I
Yeah, I
think.
don't know.
But anyway,
Yeah.
it was, and his agent kept calling him, and Harlan kept saying, "How much money?" And then the agent would call back, "Really?" And then whatever. And I mean, I'm sitting there while the whole auction is going on with Harlan drinking coffee, and it was a French company that bought Tell No One, I think that was the name of it. And that was his first, okay? And it did really well, and then it's just kind of gone on. And he writes in a way that translates well into television and the movies. But because 2 or 3 of them have been super successful, then it's just like anything he does. Elmore Leonard was like that, in his day. Elmore Leonard sold a lot of books to the movies because his books were almost all dialogue.
Yeah.
He didn't, and an example of how that doesn't work is the first time around when they tried to turn Tony Hillerman's books into television, and it didn't work because Tony's books have very little dialogue and are full of description. I mean, wonderful stuff. That's why you like reading them about the landscape and the Navajo culture and the whole bit. But terrible television. This time around, they've taken Anne's, they've added in the woman and all, and this is Robert Redford and George R.R. Martin, who can actually afford, between them, to do stuff like that. And now it's a very different, bears almost no resemblance to the original effort to bring Tony to television. And so that's a great example of they were not books really designed ever to be filmed. They were
No.
designed to be read.
Right. And also, a lot of that stuff is really interesting, but it's never, there's almost no dialogue. I mean, it doesn't, and there's no, and all this interesting stuff that you learn from research or from knowing people of that persuasion or heritage, it comes off on television as kind of painful. So because it's exposition. When I was writing for television, there was a producer who was very funny and had been a stand-up comedian, and he said, what we ought to do in this show is just have a monkey, have it be there in the midst of any dialogue, and we'll call it the exposition monkey, and we'll just bring it in every time anybody has to explain anything that takes more than a page.
I love
And
this
it's-
concept. That's so great.
and it was sounded like a good idea. I don't know.
I think it's a great. I should have been wearing like a green cap or something. There would be the monkey, the green hat monkey coming in. I love
Right.
it.
Something to look at where you're not listening. And that's
That's
a hard
right.
thing.
Well, on that note, does anybody have a question? We should end on a high, right? So we probably will. Thank you all very much for coming. Virtual audience, thank you very much for joining us. We have sold down to like just a handful of copies of Pro Bono. So thank you all for buying books. If you would like to have Tom sign your book or visit with him, you can. But I did bring out a book to give away today. And I don't know how we did things. Who has come the farthest? That's always my favorite question. Well, I know you're here from Iowa, so probably is Chris in the back. But does anybody else come from any distance? Are you all local? Sorry? Santan Valley. Ah. Okay. You, sir? Glendale. Santan Valley farther than Glendale? Probably is. All right. So this is a book called The Invisible Helix, and this is a really interesting series written by a Japanese author and translated. It's one of my husband's favorite series. And the first book in it, and probably according to its editor, whom we both know, and who's a great guy, was nominated for an Edgar, stunning everybody. But I love Detective Galileo. His beat is Tokyo. It's the one question I flunked. The New York Times runs a quiz in his book review email. One of the quizzes was for international thrillers, identify the destination or the landscape of the book. And I got everything right until we came to Inspector Galileo, and I recognized that only my husband has read them, not me. And so I flunked. I said Kyoto, and it turns out to be Tokyo. So that's how I know. Anyway, I'm going to award this book to you. I think they're a lot of fun to read. He's sort of like Agatha Christie in a Japanese way, but I hope you will enjoy it. So thank you all very much. Round of applause for Tom.